Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm Chris Sable, Executive Director for the Vail Symposium. On behalf of Dale Mosier, our board chair, and the entire Vail Symposium board, welcome. Thanks for joining us. The Vail Symposium has been offering affordable, thought-provoking programs for our community since 1971. I'd like to thank the organizations and individuals who helped make the Vail Symposium programs possible. Our presenting sponsors are the Town of Vail and the Frechette Family Foundation. Our event sponsors are Vail Resorts Epic Promise, the Vail Daily, and the Antlers at Vail. Our summer season is underwritten by Cindy Ingalls, and tonight's program is underwritten by Jeannie and Dale Mosier. Tickets cover less than 15% of the cost to run all of our programs, so donations of any size make a difference. Let's give all of our donors a round of applause, please. If you're interested in figuring out how you can support, you can do that on our website or find me. I'd be happy to talk to you about it and would love to have you join our donor family. Tonight, we present the second program in our new series. We'll be doing 4 programs a year. How many people here came for the Supreme Court program? Okay, quite a few of you, that's great. So we've got an amazing panel of experts here, and I'm going to introduce our moderator, but the series is entitled Conversations on Contentious Issues, moderated by Clay Jenkinson. Tonight our topic is U.S. immigration. So Clay is, I'd like to say, a great friend and colleague for the symposium. He's a nationally recognized historian, author, public humanities scholar with a special interest in Thomas Jefferson and the American Republic. He writes books, portrays a number of historical characters, including Thomas Jefferson. He appears in documentary films, including many of the Ken Burns films, most recently the film on Benjamin Franklin. Clay edits the National Lewis and Clark Quarterly Journal. He hosts the nationally syndicated public radio program and podcast, The Thomas Jefferson Hour, and hosts and moderates Humanities Symposium, and serves as editor-at-large for the distinguished online journal, Governing.com. He's the winner of many awards, including the National Humanities Medal, which is the highest honor bestowed by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Clay's going to tell us more about the program and get things going. Please give a warm welcome to Clay Jenkinson.
Hello, everyone. I'm just so glad to be here. I love coming here. I'm from North Dakota, so we love going anywhere. The highest peak in North Dakota is 3,506 feet. So I've been sucking air all day here. I'm going to tell a North Dakota joke, but it kind of sets up our conversation tonight. So this is a true story, actually. In 1960, when John Kennedy was elected to the presidency in North Dakota, a man named William L. Guy, Bill Guy, was elected governor, and he had a kind of Kennedy-esque feel, if that makes any sense, on the Great Plains. And he had a crew cut, and he was a farmer, so he was a kind of a prairie populist, but a small C progressive. And he's one of the best respected and best loved governors of North Dakota. And he had a family of 5 children. He had his own car, a station wagon. You remember station wagons? And because he was the governor of North Dakota, his license plate said North Dakota, and there was just a number 1. So he had the number 1 license plate in North Dakota. So this is a more innocent time. They went on vacation at Bemidji, Minnesota. They stopped at a gas station when there were gas station attendants. And the young man came out, a 17-year, 18-year-old, and he poured the gas. And he said, how do you get the number 1 license? And Bill Guy said, well, you have to be the governor of North Dakota. And the kid said, yeah, but how'd you get it? As I was preparing for this, reading about immigration, interviewing all 4 of these extraordinary people, I feel like we're friends now, watching things on YouTube, looking at polls, website after website, pondering, making notes. I asked a friend of mine in North Dakota last week, could a rational people create a a humane, enforceable, and intelligent immigration system? She said, yes, but what about us? In other words, if you could just have a Platonic academy and put this group of people in a room for a month and say, hammer it out, I feel certain we could produce significant immigration reform. Getting that through the political process, as you know, is a whole different thing. I want to ask a couple of questions as we go tonight. Here's my first question. How many of you were born in a foreign country? Keep your hands up, please. How many of you have, please keep your hands up. How many of you have a parent who was born in another country? How many of you have a grandparent who was born in another country? Now just look around for a moment. Just look around here. Think of this for a moment. All right, you can put your hands down. Isn't that interesting? I want to show you a couple of slides here, just to make sure we get into the right spirit. If this works. Yes, so, all right, so this was a poll yesterday on NBC, on MSNBC. NBC poll as the election comes, the most important issues facing the country. Threats to democracy, 21%, pretty high. Cost of living, 16%. You see there's a differential in the two parties. Jobs and economy comes in third at 14%. Immigration and border comes in fourth at 13%. Climate change at 9% and abortion at 8%. Now these polls are, this is not the only poll that I would want to consult, but look at immigration border, comes in number 4. If this is correct, this is the most important issue, so not an important issue. 30% of Republicans say that this is the most important issue, and just 2% in this poll of Democrats. That's, to my mind, a pretty amazing and even alarming statistic, if true. Would it be possible to reform our immigration system that's fair, consistent, humane, rational, and enforceable? I want to start with this. This is Sitting Bull. That's funny, because when you say illegal immigrants, I think of you. Remember our hands going up. And then it's all Indian land on the right, or Homeland Security, fighting terrorism since 1492. To be serious for a moment, we are tonight gathering in the most magnificent mountain setting. This is historic Arapaho land. This is historic Ute land, and this is historic Cheyenne land. We need to remember that. We are all newcomers from 1492. And I'll show you a map here. Well, this is the Louisiana Purchase. You see that part of Colorado was in the Louisiana Purchase, but not all of it, because Jefferson bought the entire watershed of the Missouri, but not what's west of the Missouri. And here's what's so interesting about this. A Corsican man, a French dictator who never visited the New World, sold those 828,000 square miles to a Virginian who never traveled farther than 70 miles west of his birthplace. You can see there's a paradox at the heart of the American experiment. Two white men who never visited Colorado, who wouldn't have understood Colorado, exchanged for $15.6 million, 528 million acres at 3 cents per acre. Interesting. And look at this. It's a little blurry, but here was Native American land. Here's what it looked like at the beginning of the 19th century when Jefferson was president. All of the purple, the black, the brown is native land. And we move through American history and look at it today. We're thinking about. We are a nation of immigrants. We have been talking about under what circumstances we should shut the door from the very beginning. I want to just read 2 extraordinary passages to you from the beginning of our national history. First, this is Hector Saint-Jean Crevecoeur, who wrote Letters from an American Farmer. This is 1782, so this is just right in the heart of the new national period. And he said, "What then is this American, this new man? He is either a European or a descendant of a European, hence that strange mixture of blood which you will find in no other country. I could point out to you a family whose grandfather was so-and-so. He is an American who, leaving behind him all his ancient prejudices and manners, received new ones from the new mode of life he has embraced, the new government he obeys, and the new rank he holds. He becomes an American by being received in the broad lap of our great alma mater. Here, individuals of all nations are melted into a new race of men whose labors and posterity will one day cause great changes in the world." So Crevecoeur is saying, the genius is that people from all sorts of places have come to form this people. Just 5 years later, John Jay, in the Federalist Papers, wrote this: "With equal pleasure, I have often taken notice that Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestor, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs, and who by their joint counsels, arms, and efforts, fighting side by side through a long and bloody war, have nobly established general liberty and independence." Crevecoeur, it's the mix that makes America. John Jay, it's because we're Anglos that makes America. Does it sound familiar? In the Quasi-War in 1798, our undeclared naval war against France, the Adams administration passed the Alien, Sedition, and Naturalization Acts. We won't go into the Sedition Act for the moment. The Naturalization Act was designed to prevent refugees from the French Revolution from coming here or becoming citizens, and to prevent refugees from Haiti, where the Haitian Revolution was occurring, from coming here. And the argument was, they will dilute our national mix, and they'll all, by the way, be Jeffersonian Democrats. Sound familiar? That act, the Naturalization Act, raised from 5 years to 14 the number of years you had to be in the United States to become a citizen. And you had to give the government 3 years' notice. At a time when life expectancy was about 45, 14 years is a very, very long time, 5 to 14. There were two alien acts, the Alien Friends Act and the Alien Enemies Act. The Alien Friends Act, can you imagine this, allowed the President of the United States to expel from this country anyone he regarded as a national security risk without due process. That was sunsetted at the end of the Adams administration on March 4th, 1801. But the Alien Enemies Act was not sunsetted, and it continues to be enforced to this day. It was used by President Monroe, by Secretary of State Monroe during the War of 1812. It was used by Woodrow Wilson in 1918. It was used by FDR in 1941. It was used by Harry S. Truman in 1945 and 46. My point is, this is not a new debate. This is an ancient debate. First it was the French, and then it was the Irish, and then it was the Chinese, then it was the Japanese, and then it was the Italians, and it just goes on and on and on. So, let's get to it. I'm so excited about this panel. We are not going to agree, but we've agreed to be civil. And we want to make sure your thoughts and questions are part of this. We had a little meeting downstairs before, and anyone who wants to stay afterwards, we can just go over here and we'll have a little debriefing. What did you hear and what did you like and what would you do differently if we did it again? Let me introduce these extraordinarily interesting and distinguished guests. On my immediate right, Jessica Vaughn, the Director of Policy Studies at the Center for Immigration Studies in Washington, but you live in South Carolina. Next to her, Jorge Lowery, Managing Director of Programs and Strategy for the American Immigration Council, also Washington, D.C.
Good luck.
Alex Narasta, I've got this, Director of Economic and Social Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. And then Violetta Chapin, who teaches immigration at the Immigration Clinic at the Colorado Law School in Boulder, Colorado. One from nearby, Boulder, 3 from some distance. Please welcome them to the stage. So here's our modest list of things that we want to talk about. Would it be possible to formulate a rational, reasonable, humane, and enforceable immigration policy for the United States? How can we manage the southern border of the United States so that there are not hundreds of thousands or millions of people massing there, trying by whatever means to enter this country? What should be done with the 11 or more million undocumented immigrants who are now in the United States? What should we do about DACA and the Dreamers? How much abuse is there in our asylum system, and how can we make sure that it works for those who merit it and cannot be used by those for whom who do not meet the criteria? How should we reform our legal immigration system? And how can we make sure that our border enforcement system comports with American ideals of fairness, humanity, and due process? So I think the correct answer from you is good luck. So Alex, I want to start with you because you are a libertarian.
That's correct.
And as a libertarian, you bring a unique perspective to this. So what I've been hearing for months and years now is we have a significant immigration crisis in the United States. What do you say?
I say we absolutely do. I think we have a crisis when you take a look at what's going on in the border. It has been going on for quite some time. And I think the other hand of the crisis, the other side that we don't see very often, is the crisis with the legal immigration system, and that the United States has a heavily restricted and closed off immigration system, heavily restricted compared to American history, most of American history, heavily restricted compared to other countries. And for the vast majority of people who want to come here legally, there is no way to do that. Now, you all had your hands up about if you were an immigrant, your parents were your grandparents. If we apply, and I think you're gonna, well,
you want me to show you
yeah,
your
there's
slide?
a slide up there actually that he included in his slideshow that I thought was pretty good. This is a highly simplified legal map of the current legal immigration system.
Looks like the tax code.
It's second in complexity to the tax code when you take a look at US laws, according to law professor Elizabeth Hull. So what I think is this is a crisis, a big crisis, a crisis that goes against what I think are American values, goes against our national interest, goes against what's in the best long-term interest of the United States. So if there's one thing that you learn tonight, one thing, it's that you learn that this is what the immigration system looks like, and get out of your head any idea that Ellis Island or anything like that is still open, because that closed down a long time ago and was replaced with this Soviet-style system.
Wait, you said Soviet-style?
Yeah, centrally planned, centrally managed, numbers controlled and determined by people who have no interest in determining what the numbers actually should be. No costs and benefits really, analyzed by people. System of laws on top of laws for over a century combined to make this enormous mess. A system where all immigration is illegal except for a handful of things that are specifically identified as legal. The exact opposite of every other legal system or every other code of law that we have, right? I mean, in criminal law, we don't have a law that says it's legal to shake somebody's hand, right? That's fine, but we have a law against murder. Immigration system, everything's illegal except for a few small categories that are illegal. So it's the exact opposite of every other, basically our legal traditions. So that's where I go off saying that it's Soviet-esque. It's centrally planned, and it's the opposite of the Anglo-American experience with the common law.
All right, fair enough. Nice opening statement. But you're saying that the system is in crisis, and here's a map of it.
This is a map. This is the reason why. People come illegally because they can't come legally. People broke prohibition laws and smuggled alcohol and made it illegally in their bathtubs and sold it, and crime increased because alcohol was illegal or very difficult to get legally for the vast majority of people. We didn't solve that problem with alcohol prohibition by hiring 10,000 Elliot Nesses or building walls. We solved it by legalizing it, because you can't regulate a black market. You can only regulate a legal market.
So in a nutshell, you would greatly increase the number of legal immigrants to this country.
Vastly increase the number of legal immigrants. I think if you're going to if the government should exclude somebody from coming to the United States who should have a good reason. The default should be that people should be allowed to come here, and the government should have to show that an individual should not be here because they violate or threaten the life, liberty, and private property of other people. Maybe they have an illness, maybe they're a national security threat. They've spent a little bit too much time in a mountain enclave in Afghanistan, for instance. But other than that, I think we should go back to the traditional American immigration policy of letting people in except for some very specific people who are an actual threat.
So, Alex, I'm hearing not quite open borders, but closing in on open borders and let the market determine this.
Yeah, I wouldn't say open borders. I don't mean that. I think it should be harder to come to the United States than it should be to come from, Virginia to Maryland. I think that should be harder to do that. But I do think that we should have a relatively free immigration system.
And how many agree with that point of view? Whoa, interesting. So, Jessica Vaughn, you don't agree with that point of view. Give us your view of what's the right fix on this thing. Are we in crisis, and B, what's the fix?
Well, I think we do have a border crisis. We've lost operational control of the border, and I think that's the first thing that should be fixed going forward in making any changes to our system. But I think we have to remember that there are good reasons for having immigration laws. And one is so that you can regulate the number of people who are coming here. A good analogy struck me just yesterday when I was reading that the Vail Mountain this year, maybe for the first time, is going to regulate the number of people who are going to be allowed to ski on any particular day because they recognize that there are some problems that are created if you just open it up to everyone. And immigration policy is kind of similar. When Congress has authority to make immigration laws, the executive, the president, has a lot of authority to keep people out, as Clay was saying, but he doesn't have the authority to just let people in. Congress has that authority, and they have, as our representatives, decided that there will be some problems created if we were to dispense with limits. And one of the problems is that there are more people in the world who want to come here. Are we proud? We should be proud of our country and proud of that. Then we can admit without causing problems, particularly in the labor market, that basic economics tells you that when you get more labor than can be absorbed in your economy, the price of that labor goes way down, and the reality is that people get displaced from jobs, their wages deteriorate, and it causes problems for certain people. There are people who benefit and people who lose from our current immigration policy, but the people mainly who are losing are, besides taxpayers who are, as the National Academy of Sciences found that, our current immigration policy is actually creating more costs for taxpayers than revenue that's brought in. But in my opinion, more importantly, is the effect on those people who are already on the margins of society and who are competing with new arrivals for jobs in this country. And not that the number of jobs is finite, but there is pretty strong academic research that shows that when we increase the size of labor, particularly at the lower end of the pay scale, that the price goes down, and these are people on the margins of society who are harmed by it. So there are good reasons for immigration laws, and that's why we have them. And as Vail Mountain is going to have to do, choices have to be made. So if you're going to limit, then who are you going to allow to come in? I don't know what Vail's going to decide. It might be season pass holders probably would be the first ones on the list. Well, that's kind of like family immigration. They're the highest priority in our immigration system. And the number of people who qualify as family immigrants gets larger every year because we actually have unlimited immigration of people who are spouses of U.S. citizens, whether they're native-born American citizens or naturalized American citizens. And Congress thought that it was a good idea not to limit that. And we also have limited numbers of people in other family categories. And about 14% of our legal immigration system is people who have a job offer, whose employer wants them to be able to stay permanently. That's a pretty small share of our overall legal immigration system. And a lot of people think that's out of whack.
So let me just see if I've got this right. You don't agree with Alex.
No, I think, and to be clear, I think we talked about, Alex talked about returning to traditional levels of immigration. Well, if you see that slide up there, what is a traditional level of immigration? There are times when we have had low immigration and times when we've had very high immigration. And for the last 40 years at least, it has been going constantly upward with a little blip around COVID.
So here's
we've never had time to absorb the immigrants that we have already admitted.
So here's a statistic from Pew, which is, I think, a reliable
that's the share. That's not the number, though.
But this is the percentage. So highest around the turn of the century, 1900. Sort of when you think of how the other half lives, New York, Jacob Riis, the wholesale groups of immigrants living in squalor in New York tenements came down through much of the 20th century. There's policy behind that for the most part. Got down to about 4.7% of our population in 1970. It's been rising steadily. It's at 13.7 now, and it's going probably to go beyond the previous highest point. And so I drew this map. This is my attempt to be Donald Trump. But this is what I think is concerning a lot of people, Jessica, that part of this is just beyond individual thinking. This is just at a certain point, when it goes up like this, people start to be a little anxious about what this means about our social fabric. How many can we absorb? Should there be limits? What would those limits be? And you're thinking, we have a right to set limits, and we are probably admitting too many people on both the legal and the illegal side. Is that correct?
We have a duty.
And how many people agree with that we have a right to set limits and we need to get control of this thing? All right, thank you. So Jorge, bring us into your world of this. Tell us how you see this. Do we have an immigration crisis, and how would you define it?
I do think there is a crisis in relation to immigration. I think it's, so if I had to pick between these two sort of worldviews that you just heard from, my views are closer to Alex's. Alex works at a think tank. He gets to not be concerned about the politics of the issue, which is great. I'm jealous of that to some extent. I operate in a different sphere, and I have to focus on ideas that may be also politically palatable.
Could I interrupt? It's a different sphere. Tell us a little bit what that sphere is for you.
So at my organization, we do a number of different things. One of the things that we do, though, is we advocate for specific changes through legislation on Capitol Hill, things that we think are actually possible and achievable. They are often far from what we think is ideal, but they're things that we think are something that we can do with the Congress that we currently have. So back to the original point, though, I do think there is a crisis, but it's a crisis of inaction, and inaction on the part of our Congress. We haven't updated the immigration system significantly in 30 years. We're operating with a system that was created before the inception of the internet. Our economy was very different back then. We were all very different back then. And it frankly doesn't make sense. It doesn't meet our interests as a country. It certainly doesn't meet the interests of immigrants and immigrant families. Jessica gave the example of us having unlimited immigration when it comes to the spouses of U.S. citizens. I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think the government should be in the game of telling U.S. citizens that your spouse can come here versus not, right? We should have unlimited immigration for people when they get married. The broader issue is that there aren't enough numbers that are available, and the system is incredibly cumbersome. It's subject to significant delays and bureaucracy, and even when people do qualify in many cases, it takes an extraordinary amount of time for them to actually be able to come here, to the tune of years, sometimes decades, or longer. So against that backdrop, we somehow find ourselves surprised that we have a population of 10, 11, 12 undocumented immigrants in the US, and I don't quite frankly understand that. What do we expect? If I lived somewhere else and I had if I had a brother or sister that lived in the US and I decided to uproot my family and come here and qualified through current immigration law to do so, went through the process, applied, ticked all of the boxes, and the government then told me, okay, your application looks good, but you're going to need to wait 10 to 12 years. Who's going to be willing to do that? I certainly wouldn't. So there are significant issues, there are significant pull factors and push factors that are drawing people to the southern border. The push factors are things that we often hear about. They are socioeconomic factors in people's home countries. There are environmental factors like natural disasters, political instability, war. There are many things that are pushing many people to our border, not just from Central America, but from around the world. And there are significant pull factors in the US, like the 10 million open jobs that we have right now that are drawing people here as well. Our reaction to that has been to just put our hands up when people get here, as though that's somehow going to stop people, as though if we build a wall that is tall enough or we create policies that make the hardship just so, they create immense hardship for individuals and families, that they will somehow just give up and go home. That's not how human nature works. If we want to solve the border, we need to solve our system of legal immigration.
You start with the legal side, and you're sort of close to Alex, greatly increase the number that we admit.
That's right. I think we need to increase, I think we need to admit more people than we do. I think it needs to be a number that actually fluctuates based on a number of different conditions in the country at a given moment. I think the federal government should have less of a role in this process. I don't think Congress should be involved at all, given what we've actually seen at this particular stage. I think there should be a greater role for the private sector, possibly a role for states. That the governor of the state of Colorado knows what the needs are in Vail to a far greater extent than somebody stuck behind a desk in Washington, D.C. So that's how I see it.
And that was stuck behind a desk. You weren't talking about Alex. and his think tank, his cushy think tank. So Violetta, pick it up from there.
My turn.
Your turn.
So my role is a little different. At the law school, I teach an immigration clinic, and that means that I work with second and third year law students who are starting to get out of the classroom and into the courtroom, and they're getting proximate to people, to clients. The vast majority of our clients are non-citizens who are navigating the legal system in a wide variety of different ways. We represent asylum seekers, we represent DACA recipients, we represent people that the federal government are trying to deport. I certainly believe that we have a crisis around our immigration system here, and what we see, my students and I in the clinic, is how our laws and our policies and their failures affect real people, right? Real people that live in our communities and are just trying to survive, if not thrive, in this country. We certainly have to do something about 11 million undocumented people that have lived in this country, some of them for several decades now. They are living permanently in this country, and I certainly believe that we could solve this problem in a common sense way. I do not believe that it is logistically possible, and history has panned this out, to find them and deport them all. That is not possible, and it's not kind or humane or the way that this system should operate. It also doesn't make any economic sense at all. I do think that we could set up a registration process where people would have to meet certain requirements. They have to have lived in the United States for a certain number of years. They have to, if they're able-bodied, they can show that they are working, that they are enrolled in school, or that they've enlisted in the military. They would have to have, relatively little or no prior criminal record, and they could pay potentially thousands of dollars in penalties for the initial unlawful entry into the United States. And that would be something that would be orderly, and it would be resulting in mass registration. We would know who people were who are in this country. Many of the 11 million undocumented immigrants, we don't know who they are, and we don't know where they live. And that doesn't make any sense. And we also have a history of doing something like this, sort of blanket pardon. In 1986, one of the lions of the Republican Party, Ronald Reagan, issued amnesty for the undocumented population that was here in the United States. So we've shown that we can do it. And I think we can do so that's sort of the big picture thing that I believe that we can and should be able to do. And unfortunately, our representatives have not been able to do that for many, many years. I think if we were to look for two things that we could possibly do sooner rather than later that I think should be relatively easy, would be to normalize the status of two relatively small groups of immigrants in the United States. DACA recipients, one, and people who have temporary protected status, or TPS status. The numbers of DACA recipients in Colorado, we have about 17,000 DACA recipients living in the state of Colorado.
And just for those who might not know, explain what DACA is.
Yes, I will, thank you. So DACA is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It was a program created by President Obama in 2012 after the DREAM Act failed to get through Congress. I think it was number 16 times that bipartisan legislation had been introduced and failed to pass. And the DREAM Act applies to young people who arrived in the United States at a very young age. Some of them were infants. They've grown up in the United States their whole lives. They've gone to our schools. They've thrived. We've had 4 DACA recipients come through the law school. There are about 800,000 to 1 million DACA recipients nationally. They've already registered. We have their fingerprint biometric information. We know where they live. They've passed, can't have certain criminal convictions, and we know who they are, and we should normalize their status. We have a tremendous amount of bipartisan support for DACA recipients. Temporary protected status is an even smaller number of people that have TPS. About 400,000 people in the United States have TPS from 12 different countries.
And why do they have that? What's that mean?
Temporary protected status is given to countries. So countries are designated for TPS. If there has been an environmental disaster, or like Jorge said, tremendous unrest or war that's happening. Ukraine was just designated by President Biden for TPS designations. And that allows nationals of those countries that have been designated for TPS to remain in the United States while because their country is not in a space where they can absorb them. We have some TPS recipients who've been living in the United States for over 20 years. My mother's country, my mother's from El Salvador originally, and El Salvador was designated for TPS in 2001 after 2 earthquakes, pretty much devastated half the country. And TPS recipients from El Salvador have become deeply embedded in our communities. They've bought homes, they've had children. We have 18 employees at CU Boulder who have TPS from El Salvador. They are our custodians and our dining services staff. I'll tell you quickly about 2 of them, Rosa and Jose. They're married, they've been married for 32 years. They have 2 boys. Their boys are both enrolled as undergraduates at CU Boulder. They recently were recognized by the University of Colorado for 20 years of service to the university. They own their home in Erie, and they've been registering every 2 years for TPS protections. And I think that's an easy sell, absolutely. We should be normalizing their immigration status and allowing people to live, not just to survive, but to thrive, to live with more stability in their lives, with more prosperity in their lives, and more dignity.
So if I hear you correctly, you would like to normalize the lives of the 11+ million, the TPS people, the DACA and the Dreamers, and you think this would be, forget politics, but this would be relatively easy to do, and you're not saying blanket amnesty, you would be willing to consider registration requirements, et cetera, maybe even fines, but you think this should be done?
I do think it should be done. I think it should be easy to navigate. And I think we can certainly get it done.
So how many of you think that we should do this, that there should be amnesty with conditions or amnesty for the 11+ million plus TPS and Dreamers and DACA? Wow. Jessica, you're up against it here.
Well, no, you didn't ask me.
I will ask you, but hang on just a second. Well, I will. Let's just do it right now. Go ahead.
I'm not opposed to that necessarily, but to me, it's an issue of sequencing that I think what Congress should be conscious of is what has happened in past amnesties, and that is that the amnesty comes first with promises to change the system, promises to enforce the law going forward, and the amnesty occurs and the enforcement never follows. And so
or the reforms never follow either. You're right.
Don't have a problem with an amnesty for people with DACA and a lot of the people who have TPS. But I think that we should first make sure that we're not going to have the exact same problem years down the road because the enforcement failures are not corrected.
So let's just say, hang on.
So that's like, yeah, I'm in favor of it with conditions.
But let's just say that we did this, and politically this seems very unlikely to me, but let's say we did it. you're saying, I think, or a conservative on this question would say, A, that's incentive for others to do exactly the same thing because we're rewarding this and we're rewarding it in a pretty fulsome way. And B, 12, 15 years from now, it's going to be X million more people that we're just going to do this over and over and over again. And it's no way to run an immigration policy.
Exactly. Yes, I agree.
That's your view. Alex.
I mean, one of the interesting things you said, Jessica, was how the enforcement never followed, but there are 5 times more Border Patrol agents now than there were in 1986. The government really did increase enforcement a lot, but they didn't increase legal pathways.
Well, remember, not every person who comes illegally comes over the border. The estimates are that perhaps 40% of the people who are living here illegally came with a legal visa and overstayed that. So it's not just about the number of Border Patrol agents. We have 20,000 Border Patrol agents now. You know, I think that should be enough. The problem is we have policies whereby even when people surrender themselves to the Border Patrol, they are allowed to come stay for an indefinite period, and knowing that there's not going to be any effort to remove them if they don't if they don't file their asylum application, which 50% of them do not do after being allowed to enter saying that they were going to seek asylum. When they don't show up at their court cases, when it's ultimately found that 90% of them are not found by immigration judges to meet the criteria for asylum. I don't understand why we're allowing all these people to come in to pursue asylum claims, giving them a work permit, having them qualify for all kinds of benefits, when 90% of them are not going to succeed or be found eligible, and no one's going to make an effort to have them to go home. So,
yeah, I mean, maybe I'm betraying my age here, but every job I've ever had, I've had to fill out an I-9 form. If you guys remember that, if you've had jobs recently, to show that you're lawfully able to work. That was a regulation, that was a law that was created as part of the Reagan amnesty as an interior enforcement. My brother, when he got a new job in Texas, he worked for a company that had something called E-Verify, which is a government system that checks your identity against government databases, and you get a nice Big Brother stamp that says you're legally eligible to work. A lot of people have to go through these types of things. So there's, I think, a good amount more enforcement than you're letting on. It just imposes an enormous cost on everybody because everybody has to do it, because it's not like I can look at somebody and say, well, that person's an illegal immigrant, that person's not, right? We all have to go through it. Like, all this enforcement is also in cost imposed on American citizens.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's not really enforcement, that's compliance.
Well, but it's a burden, right? I mean, I have to fill out a form.
most of the people most of the employers who are using E-Verify don't feel that it's a burden at all. They feel that it's working to help them avoid hiring illegal workers. And they think it's important to do, especially those employers who are doing their due diligence in hiring and have to compete with employers who are undercutting them with costs by hiring illegal workers that they don't pay taxes on, don't pay workers' comp on, pay lower wages to.
So let me jump in here. So Jorge, something Jessica said I think is worth talking about more, that the asylum system, people come, they claim asylum, they're admitted into the country, the court dates are set, not everyone meets those court dates, there's a huge backlog, some people game the system, some people disappear into the vastness of the United States and are unaccountable. Is that how you see it? I mean, how much asylum abuse is there? Give us your perspective on this.
I have a very different view. First of all, the idea that everyone who's coming here gets let in, and they're let in for an indefinite period of time to do as they wish, and there's no enforcement on the back end, is simply not true. Ports of entry remain closed. They've been closed for over 2 years now, meaning that people who want to seek asylum, which is their legal right, are being pushed to enter between ports of entry, are being pushed and forced by the government to enter unlawfully to try to exert that right. We also have a policy in place right now that remains in place in this administration that was created by the Trump administration of summarily expelling people when they are encountered at the southern border. The number of people that are subject to those expulsions has gone down over time. It's still in the range of 50% of all people that are encountered are not afforded any due process whatsoever. Their photos are taken, their biometrics are taken, and they're quickly dumped into Mexico, which is very important. One, because they're not allowed to seek asylum, as we were just told. That's not true. And two, there are no collateral consequences for them to continue to try over and over and over again, right? So if you're just dumped into Mexico, you don't want to return to your home country for whatever reason, whether it's economic or because of some sort of political issue, persecution, and you're encountered by the Border Patrol, you're dumped into Mexico, what are you going to do? What is the incentive? The incentive is to try again and again and again and again until you're ultimately successful, right? That's why we have had dozens of people, or we've had people who have been encountered by the Border Patrol dozens of times, because that is the system that we have now. You can't go to the port of entry. You have to enter unlawfully, and if you're encountered, just try again and again and again until you ultimately get in, or something worse happens. So, shifting from that over to the point that Jessica made about people not appearing for their hearings, we did a very deep academic study of the government's own records, the immigration courts, 11 years worth of records, over 10 million hearings, that found that immigrants who are not represented by attorneys appeared for over 86% of all of their hearings. Those that were represented by attorneys appeared for nearly all of them, in excess of 96% of them, which, if you actually think about it, makes sense. If you're here to seek asylum, the only way you're going to get protection, the only way you're going to get stability is by complying with the terms that the government has set out for you. The other issues that arise tend to arise because of the complexity of the system. We have people that, many of them have left their lives behind. It's a moment of turmoil in their lives. This is an extraordinarily complicated system, as you all have already heard, and these people are forced to navigate it without the assistance of an attorney in the vast majority of cases. So, of course, some people are going to screw things up. It's just the way that it is, and we set people up for failure. That is the problem. That is a core issue that we need to work to address.
All right, so Violetta, I will come back to you. Go ahead, Violetta.
My goal in life is for there one day to be a public defender for immigrants. It does not exist. We have public defenders for people who are charged with crimes in this country. In 1965, we had the wonderful case of Gideon versus Wainwright, which said that everybody who is charged with a crime in this country is going to have the assistance of counsel. Because if the government is trying to take your liberty away and put you in a jail cell, maybe you should have a lawyer with you in order to combat those claims. We do not afford lawyers at government expense to immigrants who are trying to navigate an extraordinarily complex immigration system, as you see. So the vast majority of immigrants who are asked to appear in court or told to appear in court are going to go without a lawyer. When we take cases from the Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network in Westminster, Colorado, which is one of the few nonprofit agencies that's representing immigrants at either no or low cost, they'll give me a list of 25 people. Violetta, which one can you take? 25 people who need a lawyer. We take one of those cases in the clinic. We're the only free show in town. And all of our clients come to court with us because they know that we will be there with them. They know that we will stand up and make arguments on their behalf. We know that we will explain the system to them so they can understand what their choices are. And they can make informed decisions about that. We have an immigration system that does not do that for the vast majority of immigrants that are asked to navigate our system, and then we wonder why people may not show up for court. But as you've just heard, the vast majority of them still do. We still have an extraordinarily low asylum grant rate. For people who appear in front of judges, I think the number is 14%. Right?
Wait a minute, say that again.
14% of people who are winning their asylum claims.
Who are winning their
low.
claims. Their claims are being denied even in the court system.
Right, after they've come in. And so, and a lot of them are having to navigate that without counsel. And of course they're going to lose their claims because they don't know what is the evidence that I should present. You know, when we litigate asylum cases in the clinic, my students spend hours amassing country conditions reports to detail, right, the tremendous rate, for example, of rape that's happening in the country of Guatemala of single women who own their own businesses, for example. We spend hours prepping an expert to testify about those country conditions. We spent hours prepping our client to be able to get through a cross-examination from an attorney from the Department of Homeland Security. Because you know what we do fund is we fund a vast sort of army of lawyers from the government to stand up against immigrants and argue that they should be deported while we fail to provide them with counsel on the other side.
Let me just ask a question about that. So 14% achieve asylum in these hearings. So what happens to the other 86% when they're denied?
It's tough. I mean, you have some limited appellate rights that you can do, or you're told that you have to leave.
And do they?
Yeah, I think that, yeah, there's with compliance with removal orders, there is compliance with removal orders, but because it's so difficult to stay, you'll have some folks who don't, right? And they believe that the reason why they asked for asylum is that they will die, right? Or be tortured if they return to their countries. They don't have that option in order to go back. But people do.
But I'm going to come to Jessica here in a minute, but for Jorge and for you, Violetta, the sense one gets from just sort of being in the news miasma of America is that a lot of people claim asylum who really don't qualify, that it's a gambit, it's a mechanism that people use as one possible path, and that people disappear into this country and are never found, that the people who are denied asylum don't all go back. In fact, the sense is that a very large number, maybe the majority, disappear into the country. And you're saying that's not true?
I'll answer the first question, if I may, and ask Jorge to answer the second.
Okay.
First of all, asylum seekers have to go through at least two processes. They have to go through the initial credible fear interview that happens when they first enter. And then, if they're not immediately placed in removal proceedings, they can make an affirmative petition to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services for asylum. If they lose that, if they're denied there, they may be placed in removal proceedings, and they can then try to defend themselves in front of a judge in terms of asylum proceedings. And they are asked to provide evidence of the persecution and the torture that they make. So it's very difficult to make a credible fake asylum claim because you have to provide substantial information and evidence that supports what it is that you're saying. All of the asylum clients that we have represented have had tremendously credible stories, and we have been able to find evidence that corroborates their stories. For example, police reports of their children being kidnapped and tortured. We have been able to find those things. And it is a rigorous enough process that I think it's difficult to commit the kind of fraud that people think might be rampant in the system, that my experience with that is completely opposite.
So the work you're doing at CU Boulder, do you have a higher success rate than 14% then?
We've won all of our asylum
So
cases.
do you choose?
We're batting 1,000.
Is it? Wait a minute. So, but there's an important distinction I want you to make here. So, do you win them all because if everybody had access to your kind of services, that the success rate would skyrocket, or do you pick and choose ones that you're likely to win?
Oh no, I don't know anything about the clients. I literally picked the number one first one off the list. We didn't know much about them until we met them. They are successful because they have a lawyer at their side, and they have students who are scared of getting a D in clinic. And so they're working very hard, but you're going to have lawyers who are working for their clients, who are making a wage that allows them to survive, are going to do their due diligence and work hard for their clients. And I think we win because they had assistance of counsel, and we amassed the evidence that they needed.
So how many clinics like yours are there in this country?
Every law school in America that I know of has live client clinics available for students in their second and third year to do that. I actually don't know the number of immigration clinics that exist at the moment, but they sort of widely vary. There are definitely some immigration clinics that specialize in asylum law. There are other immigration clinics that do other kinds of immigration work. It might not be direct representation, it might be sort of big impact litigation. But we do have a good number of law schools. I think the number is 250 law schools. But it's a pittance, right? We're not able to represent nearly as many people as we would like to, as deserve.
But you're saying that if we greatly increase the number of clinics and the number of public defenders to do this, that the rate of asylum, granting asylum would go much, much higher.
Well, we have a federal public defender system already. They exist, they're very well funded. And they represent people in the federal system who are charged with crimes.
Right.
Immigration is a civil system.
Yeah.
Please remember that.
That's the big difference.
It's a big difference, and it's how the government justifies, and I don't think it's justifiable though, that, it's because we're not putting them in prison, right? It's a civil violation to be in the United States without the proper paperwork, and the remedy for that violation is removal, not prison. Although we have figured out a way to criminalize immigration violations. But immigration as a whole is a civil system, which is how we have defended ourselves, but I don't think it's defensible anymore to say that's why we're not providing them a lawyer at government expense.
So Jorge, she wants to hand it to you first on this question of asylum, compliance, people disappearing into the country and so on.
I mean, this is a difficult question to answer. There are many people that navigate the asylum system from within detention. There are also many people that navigate the asylum system after being paroled into the U.S. If somebody is ultimately ordered removed, that is an order that is enforceable by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. This is an agency that has year over year, nearly every single year since it was first created in the early 2000s, received record levels of funding and has enormous capacity to execute removal orders. We detain tens of thousands of people every single year in this country. Many people have to navigate the asylum system, one, without an attorney, but also detained in an immigration detention center like the one that we have here in Aurora, that I spent hundreds of hours in myself, and are forced to navigate that very complicated process on an expedited path and without the assistance of counsel. People that are detained are obviously removed summarily if they are unsuccessful in their claims. The number of people that we have in detention right now is in the range of 22,000. That's a lot of people across the country. The record number of people that we've had in detention in 2019 was in excess of 55,000. It's an extraordinary network of facilities that we have all around the country where we jail people for immigration violations, but we just don't call it jail. It looks like a jail, it smells like a jail, it is a jail, but we just say it's not, so we're somehow okay with it. There are other people that are ultimately paroled into the country and allowed for a variety of reasons. Families, as an example, the Biden administration made a very important decision to not do what the Obama administration started and what the Trump administration continued, which was to detain families, parents with young children, throughout the pendency of their proceedings. It's a very important decision, something that has gone missed has not been highlighted effectively in the discussion about these issues. But families are released because of that decision and allowed to navigate the process from outside of detention. Obviously, this is a government-run program. Like any other government-run program, there will be abuse. It exists. But this is the only government-run program that I'm aware of where there is both abuse and people are using that abuse. We can disagree about how much of it there actually is to call for ending the system entirely. People abuse Social Security. Nobody's calling for us to end Social Security. Same thing with Medicare, same thing with any federal program that you can think of. This is, in my mind, a pretext. It's something that does exist, that does need to be addressed. It's not the vast majority of cases, it's nowhere near that.
So just say that again, because I think that's so important, that you're saying that of course there's abuse. It's these things, of course, this happens from time to time, but it's not as widespread as people think, and it's being used as a pretext for shutting it down and despairing of this having any validity at all. That's your view?
Yes.
Right. So Jessica, you've been very patient, but I want to...
Yeah, a lot of good information here, and we're getting a little bit technical, but I just want to give some context and then ask a question of Violeta and Jorge. So about 4% of the millions of cases on ICE's docket who are in proceedings or who have been ordered removed, about 4% are in detention. There also are about 1 million, almost 1 million people who have had their due process and been ordered removed by an immigration judge who are still here, still living here, had all their due process. Of the people, I think we agree, of the people now arriving at the border illegally and turning themselves over to Border Patrol, about half of them are being expelled, but about half of them are being let in. Many of those, I'd say probably about 70%, are offered something called parole, which is not like parole in the criminal sense, but they're allowed in, most of them, because they said they feared return. So, but we also know from the Department of Justice data that only half of those people that were allowed to come in will actually file an asylum claim, even though they said the reason they were coming was because they feared return and were going to apply for asylum. So only half of them actually do. Half of those, again, according to the Department of Justice's data, don't appear for their immigration proceeding. Of those who do appear for their immigration proceedings, only 14% are succeeding in their cases. And so my question for you folks is, how should we enforce the rules when people have gone through the generous due process that we're allowing them to have, and then they don't comply with it? What do we do then?
I think we have to give them lawyers to make it possible for them to do so. So first of all, the asylum rule is that you have to apply for asylum within 1 year of entering, which seems like a long time, but people spend a few months like just trying to get situated and figure out where they're going to stay and where they're going to live and how are they going to feed their children and what are they doing. A lot of the people obviously who are coming may not speak English, right? We don't have free interpretation services. The I-589 application is long and complicated.
But they do get legal orientation and services that are provided when they're in government custody before they're released.
Well, so there's limited legal orientation programs that are available in detention. And once they're released, there's not at all any sort of guaranteed free legal orientation that they would be permitted to go to. The vast majority of people who are released into the country and are given a court date are like, all right, good luck. Show up in San Antonio, Texas in 3.5 weeks and tell us what you got, right? And people have absolutely no idea what to do next. And we permit them to sort of flounder around, and it's a chaotic system. I think everyone here can agree that chaos is not something that we should
right, but
want
that's not my
or
question.
tolerate.
My question is, what do you do with the ones who do make it through the process and then don't comply?
When you say don't comply, I guess I don't agree with your language, Jessica. I don't think people are purposely not complying because they want to flout the rule of law. I think people have no guidance, people have no assistance, and they have no resources to actually apply for immigration benefits that they are eligible for.
But these are the ones who've gone through court and been ordered removed by a judge and know they're supposed to show up. They're given a letter. They know that they're supposed to show, and some judges will not give them a removal order. They'll say, okay, I'm going to give you a more generous form of removal, which is voluntary departure. So I know you have kids in school, so you don't have to leave for 3 months or 6 months. A lot of those don't comply either. So, I mean, again, like, do we just ignore that?
Do we want compliance with bad rules?
Yeah, no.
I mean, if the rules are bad, do we want to enforce them?
What if the rules are there for a good reason?
Yeah, but they're not.
Well, that's where we disagree.
See,
And
that's
that's the fundamental thing, I think, that separates us all in our views, is that we don't agree on some of the most basic.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of laws that I don't want to
reason.
enforce. And no, I don't want to punish people who engaged in an activity that is unlawful, but there's no victim. So, like, what's the problem?
Okay.
Let's stop there for a
There's
moment.
not a victim.
You're not a victim.
Let's stop
but
there
that's
for a moment. As the moderator, I'm taking control for a moment.
I can mute the mics.
No. That's not gonna mute mine. So let me ask the audience here, our citizens. Here's what frustrates me. I'm no expert. I'm learning a lot from all of you.
You know a lot.
I really am so delighted to have this chance because I'm not an expert in this. I'm just a citizen, and I've been doing all this homework so that I would be a minimally competent moderator. But I'm already, way over my head here. But here's what frustrates me. I want some entity that we can all trust to give us the stats on this. How many don't comply? How many disappear into the country? How many game the system? How many have disingenuous claims? Your view is one. You two have a somewhat different view. And I don't know who to believe exactly. But don't you find it frustrating that we're always in this position of not knowing? And it seems like these are knowable things, right? These are knowable statistics. And so why can't we have the Pew Trust or the National Endowment for the Humanities or Stanford University or somebody?
Center for Immigration Studies.
Why can't we find, so that you would all say, let's agree on the facts. Let's agree on the facts. Then we can talk about how we see it. But if we can't agree on the facts, then we throw up our hands and we just choose our tribe, right?
Well, part of the problem is that chart that you showed about the complexity of the legal immigration system. I mean, the way that we're talking about the stats, we're slicing and dicing and saying, well, these people do this, and a subcomponent of that has this percentage. And unfortunately, you have to do that when you talk about these really super complex bureaucratic systems. So you can slice it and dice it in a million different ways, and all of these statistics may be true from the subcomponents that you're taking a look at, but do you guys really interested in like the subcomponent of asylum that has this percentage of approval in this city versus, I mean, you have a million statistics about this system that will show a million different things, and they can all be correct, and would that really reveal very much? No. No. I mean, I can talk to you, we can look at the census data to tell you about the number of pigs that are slaughtered every day in the United States, the amount of corn that's harvested in different areas and how it's harvested, and this, that, and the other, rainfall. Okay, a million statistics. Is that really going to tell you like anything super? Is that going to give you like a super great sense of something deep about what agricultural policy should be in the United States? Like, it tells you a million different things.
No, I believe knowledge is power, but I'm going to change the subject here. First, I'm with Violetta. I could not navigate this. Could you? For 30 seconds. I want an advocate. I want an ombudsman. I want somebody who says, look.
Well, you can hire one. Nobody says you can't have a lawyer.
But yeah, I mean, that's a kind of insane thing.
Well, they paid a smuggler, so.
So I think that navigating a system as complex as this must be a nightmare for people who are here, and they haven't exactly taken the LSAT before they moved up.
But no, but I think Violetta should be congratulated for her success rate and for the work that she devotes on behalf of her clients. I think that's really important.
I'm going to change the subject. Visa overstay. One of the concerns we have is visa overstay. No coaching from the audience. Visa overstay. So, is this? How big a problem is this? What's your view, Jessica?
Well, again, it's pretty impossible to count because we don't actually have a true and fully accurate recording system for entries and exits. We don't count people at the land borders. We count people who fly or take a cruise ship in and out of the country, but people who are better with numbers than I estimate that there are about 40% of the, let's say, 11, I think it's more like 12 million people who are here illegally came with a visa and did not leave when they were supposed to.
What percentage?
40.
40. Almost half
40.
Overstay their visa for various reasons, I'm
guessing. What we believe. That's our best guess.
That's your best guess. Does anyone dispute that?
Well, that's the GAO's best guess. And some of the sources you cited previously, that's their guess.
40 to 50% is the general estimate, somewhere in there.
So that's a problem, not for you, because you think.
Well, it is a problem. No, so the thing is, I want to vastly liberalize immigration and make it easier, but there is a problem that's created by the system, which is the chaos. So nobody likes chaos. I don't like the fact that a large number of people who come here, mostly on tourist visas, overstay their visa. But the reason why they do that is because they can't come in on a work visa, because they don't exist. So what do you expect? What are they going to do? They're going to come in any way they can, a lot of them, not all of them, of course. A lot of people are deterred by the immigration enforcement that occurs and by the system in place. But a lot of the people who see enormous benefits from coming here, and by the way, the benefits of coming here, economic benefits, for Central America and the Caribbean is a 4 to 10-fold increase in their wages. 4 to 10-fold, and that takes account of the cost of living. Like, I would take my kids out of school and move across the world for like a twofold increase in my salary, right? But that's not going to make much of a difference in my life. But okay, I'll get like a nicer car, right? But who cares? Like, I already have a car. It's not the but for a lot of these people, it's between having like central heating and not having central heating, or sending all of their kids to school through high school and maybe sending half of them through high school. And it's a difference in terms of about a dozen years of extra life, because being wealthier people do live longer. It's called the Preston Curve by an economist who came up with that and discovered that. So if we create it, we make it impossible, and this system makes it impossible for the vast majority of people who want to come here legally to do so. They're going to find other ways to do it, and part of that is to use the existing visas, such as tourist visas, to come in, to say, yeah, I'm going to go to Disneyland, and then they go and instead go work in Irvine, California and get a job. And that is the predictable consequence. Black markets, gray markets, illegality is the predictable consequence when you separate willing buyers from willing sellers. Because Americans want to hire these folks, we want to sell them goods and services, immigrants want to work, the law says you can't, the result is going to be black markets. And that is predictable, that is foreseeable, that happens everywhere. It happens here. We shouldn't be surprised. I want to end the chaos. I want to end the chaos.
This is your prohibition analogy.
Prohibition analogy, you can make it for the analogy for illegal drugs. Currently in the United States, you can make it for any market. Now, some things, of course, should be illegal, right? Like murder should be illegal where there's a victim. But this is a situation where you have a mutually beneficial voluntary exchange. People want to sell their labor. Other people want to buy it. What's the problem?
So Violette, I want to ask you a different kind of question. We got to keep moving, and I want to get the audience involved here, just a couple of minutes. You said to me earlier that migration is a huge global subject, and that we're one subset of this, but migrations of peoples are way beyond our current situation. And talk a little bit about the migration phenomenon and our capacity to be frustrated by it, but not knowing quite how to handle that issue.
Well, we're seeing massive global displacement all over the world for a number of reasons, right? There's famine, there's people who are starving, there's also a lot of war and fighting that is forcing people to leave where they are living and move to other places. And so, for example, we see the war in Ukraine, where there's been a Russian invasion. You see historic, enormous millions of Ukrainians fleeing, and they're mostly going to other countries that are closer to Ukraine. Right, I mean, Spain is absorbing Ukrainians, and you're seeing a massive relief effort sort of mounted because the war is unfolding in front of our eyes. Aid agencies in the United States are seeing a tremendous amount of aid that is going to Ukrainian refugees, even though the United States is absorbing a very small percentage of the Ukrainian refugees that are leaving.
Say 100,000 is the plan, right?
The Biden administration is committed to absorbing 100,000 Ukrainian refugees, and I 100% support that. We absolutely should be doing that. What we've seen is a orderly, humane process of paroling Ukrainian refugees into the United States by way of a mechanism called Humanitarian Parole. They've been entering through the southern border and through our northern border, and some of them been able to fly in. And in Tijuana, where many of them, thousands of them, had to stay, we could see the visuals, right, of the camps. It wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but families were together, right? They were all living there together, and then they were, in an orderly process, paroled into the United States. And what it shows is that the United States is capable of absorbing refugees who need comfort and refuge in an orderly, dignified, and compassionate way. And those refugees now, some will, some won't, apply for asylum to remain here in the United States. If you're going to, a lot of people, they want to go back. Right? That's their country and where they live, and they're hoping for a way. But while they're here, we are going to give them a work permit so that they can support themselves and feed their families. In Colorado, we're absorbing less than 1% of the Ukrainian refugees. A few weeks ago, we hosted a clinic at the law school where we helped 32 Ukrainian refugees apply for a work permit. I talked to all of them, and we're going to represent 2 of them who are seeking asylum here in the United States. And they are asking the Ukrainians to apply affirmatively for asylum. I don't think they should necessarily have to go through that process. They're also asking refugees from Afghanistan. That was excuse my language, shit show. When we were coming out of Afghanistan, as some of you may remember, we have absorbed thousands of Afghani refugees into the Colorado area, and we are forcing them to apply affirmatively for asylum. Whereas I think we should just allow them to remain if that's what they want to do, and streamline the process to make it much easier and much less onerous for people to do that. And I think other countries have figured out ways to streamline their immigration system. Other countries have figured out ways to absorb people in a more easy way, especially since they know that they're navigating a new legal system and navigating a new language and culture. And that's something that we should be doing too.
And everything I read says migration is going to grow immensely in the next decades.
Because of the climate.
Because of climate and other factors. So, but just I want to go up to this, I want to get to the wall here. We couldn't do this without at least talking about the wall for a moment. So here's what I heard this morning from Jared Kushner on one of the talk shows. Stay with me. Come on, folks. That we now have 741 miles of wall, only 80 of which were actually new wall created under the Trump administration, but 80 new miles of wall and 452 existing fences or walls were improved under the spending and the initiative of the Trump administration. And you can see where it is, and there are, I think Kushner said that there were another 100 and some miles that they really thought were necessary, but hadn't been done by the end of the administration. So here's my question. How many of you think that a wall in some form of that term is a useful thing on the border? And how many of you just think that a wall is just a bad way of dealing with this? Interesting, okay. So, hard to know, but you know that if there's 741 miles of wall, that's about a third of the entire border. And much of the border is in places which are not critical problem places for passage of people over the border. And so we do have a significant wall now, and you've seen some of it. By the way, this is where immigrants tend to cluster in the United States. In my own North Dakota, not so much. And the Canadians are building a very big wall right here, because they're afraid of that North Dakota element. But you can see where immigrants tend to cluster, and so it's not in the heartland too much. Chicago quite a bit, but I think that's a really interesting graph. And I want to go back to, so here's one form of the wall. Alex, you're going to say, put up all the walls you want. People are going to find a way. Because look at this. This is a pretty scary image. And there are tunnels. And so does anyone here want to speak to wall as potentially useful, completely nonsensical? What do you say, Jessica?
There are legitimate operational purposes and reasons for having physical barriers in some parts of the land border. Basically in places where it can be patrolled, in populated areas in particular. And it has made an enormous difference in our ability to secure the border and preserve a quality of life for people who live near the border and have lived near the border for generations, many of them. I've been to a number of places where there are physical barriers, and they work. I don't think we need to wall off, all of the land borders. That would make no sense. But it does work in certain places, and there are a few more miles that could be built. But no wall is going to work if you have policies that allow those who enter around the wall to come in anyway.
So, yes, Jorge, I'm sorry.
So the wall is, I'm glad you brought this topic up. The wall is this sort of unique issue that I guess I view a little bit differently than probably most people on the panel. I agree with the point that it's very useful in certain locations. I don't think it's a tool that would be useful across the entire border. There are examples of people cutting through it very easily. There are many, many videos that are available of people simply climbing over it. I don't think it's particularly effective at keeping people out. It certainly does nothing to address the issues that drive people to come to our border in the first place. Having said that, though, we've done quite a bit of research on public opinion with respect to certain, a variety of different immigration-related issues. And one of the things that we have found is that the people who believe that the wall is necessary, that belief is something that is incredibly closely held. It is a non-negotiable. It's something that they're not willing to give up. The closest sort of analog on the left is opposition to family separation. People closer to my sort of worldview believe that we should not be in the business of tearing kids from their parents in the immigration context, period, the end. That's not negotiable. That's something that I believe in. I'm not willing to give up. I'm not
How
willing
many
to-
of you agree with that? There should, under no circumstances should we be dividing parents from their children.
Well, I don't know about no, but circumstances, but in most circumstances.
Thank you. Go ahead,
So,
keep on.
so the point remains, right? This is something that is very important to many, many people across the country. I don't think it's effective. I don't think we should do it. But given the place that it sort of holds in many people's minds, I do think that there's an important potential discussion to have about the role in negotiations for potential immigration reform. If we want to build a wall in exchange for legalizing 11 million people, do it.
So, Alex, I want to ask you this question because I think that you're sort of dispassionate on these questions in a certain way.
That's a nice way of saying I'm a libertarian.
A vile libertarian, but I wasn't going to say that, but I'd say vile libertarian.
Yeah.
But so how many of you in the last, I don't want to make this just the Trump administration, but in the last number of years, seeing the reports on ABC and CBS and NBC and all these networks of the pain on the border, the human tragedy of the border. How many of you have felt ashamed of America for letting this happen? So here's my question for you, Alex, is I don't trust media necessarily to do this in a fair way, but do you think that the country kind of gets it right, that this is a shameful misuse of basic humanitarian respect?
Absolutely. I mean, without a doubt, this is an absolute travesty of human rights. It's a travesty. It's a waste of resources, taxpayer resources. It's a travesty of human rights for the, for the migrants and for their families here and for everybody involved. It's a tremendous waste. Like Jorge said, like if you want to trade an amnesty for building a wall, sure. You want to trade increasing legal immigration for building a wall, sure. I'd also burn $50 billion in the desert, too, in a giant fire, if that appeased the gods of nativism enough to get these policies. So, I'd build lots of temples to this nonsense, right? But I have 3 little kids at home, and, libertarians aren't known for being the most empathetic individuals in their psychological constructions. But I felt a lot of pain and grief, and I still do, seeing what's happening down there on the border. Every policy in any area affects people, but when you see it down there affecting people like this every day, I think it's a travesty. And the thing that really gets me is there's not a good reason for it. If there was some great harm that would arise by having the immigration policies that I want, that you could convince me of. I wrote a whole book about what the greatest potential harm is and why.
And tell us the name of that book.
Wretched Refuse, The Political Economy of Immigration and Institutions, Cambridge University Press.
And that's a quotation from the Statue of Liberty.
Yes. And so, I just want to hear what the downsides are of immigration that are so enormous that they justify the government using force, using violence to do what they're doing. And that doesn't count the millions of people who are locked in other countries, who are deterred from ever trying to come here and are locked in poverty when there are opportunities here for them. Like, what is the harm that is so great that we are preventing by doing these things?
All right, so Jessica, you raised your hand that you were ashamed of some of this too, of course, but I think you're going to say there is harm, in other words, it's not that he's making it seem as if this cannot be justified. But I think you're going to say it's really unpleasant and upsetting, but it's a situation that's going to automatically create some family pain because people are coming here and we don't open the gates, and so we have this kind of unsystematic and chaotic system. I think you think there's a cost that he's not measuring.
Right. Immigration, particularly at the levels that we have now, is not a free lunch for a lot of people. It benefits a lot of people, but there are some who are disadvantaged by it, and those are the people who were working for employers who cast them aside in favor of hiring illegal workers that they didn't have to pay as much. or people who simply weren't offered opportunities for jobs because employers would rather hire people brought in by a labor contractor, people that contractor reported in his hometown in another country. You know, I mean, I think about people like my next door neighbor when I was growing up. His name was Billy. He was what we would now call disabled mentally. He went to a different school. He didn't have to work when he graduated from high school, but his parents wanted him to work because there is dignity in work. And he got a job as a custodian at a nursing home. That job was his lifeline to, you know, worth as a human being. He loved that job. It was a custodial job. That's a job a lot of people say Americans won't do. I think that we need to be concerned about the 50, you know, we heard that there are 10 million job openings now. Well, there are 55 million Americans of working age who have dropped out, stopped looking for work. And that number has been increasing for 40 years. And 35 million of them are people without more than a high school education. And these are the folks that are most directly disadvantaged when we allow employers the ability to have, you know, a constant stream of workers who will work for less. That becomes a crutch for them where they don't have to compete for workers. They don't have to offer more money. They don't have to innovate and use technology to improve productivity. Instead, they can just cast aside people who have dropped out and stopped looking for work. And there's an enormous social consequence to ignoring this problem, which exists for a lot of different reasons, not just immigration policy. But I think those 55 million people who've dropped out of the labor force deserve some attention from our policymakers, particularly in immigration.
Violetta, then Alex.
Of the 11 million undocumented people that live here, or maybe 12 million undocumented people that live here, the vast majority of them work, and the vast majority of them would prefer to work with authorization. And so the way to solve this problem of employers abusing the system, potentially, you know, hiring people for less wages, potentially subjecting them to workplace abuses, is to legalize the status of those 12 million people so that they have lawful authorization to work. They have legal redress should their employer abuse them while they're on the job. That's the practical, common sense solution to that.
Why does it happen in our legal programs too? I mean, just making everyone legal doesn't solve that problem, and they're not all going to go get lawyers, and and it doesn't solve the wage issue.
Oh, I can talk about that.
Talk about the wage issue.
Yeah, so 2 points I'd like to make about that. Immigrants are workers. They're also people who buy things. And so you have an increase in the supply of workers and an increase in demand for goods and services supplied by the workers.
And they're taxpayers.
They're taxpayers. I don't like taxes, so I won't count that. But George Borjas at Harvard University is the most well-known skeptic of the benefits of immigration, and he found what is the most negative finding in the academic peer-reviewed literature of the impact of immigrants on wages. And what he found is that immigrants raise the relative wages of native-born Americans who have a high school degree or above by about a percentage point, give or take, and that they only lower the relative wages of high school dropouts by about 1.7%. And by relative wages, I mean their wages relative to other groups of Americans by education. But when you take a look at the numbers, no wage declines by immigration by the most prominent, well-respected immigration skeptic, peer-reviewed economist. And I spend most of my day...
You're leaving some groups out.
Well, I'm not leaving out real economists. I'm leaving out...
No, I'm talking about people who are harmed by immigration, because what George Borjas also found was that for blacks, their wages declined by like 8%. And if you're making not much money, 8% means a big difference to you.
Well, that was a different
And if
model.
you can't get a job because an employer is choosing to hire someone else,
right,
that's a big problem too. That's displacement.
Yeah, but that was 8% relative to the other wage groups in there. It's not an absolute decline of 8%, which
If
often
it's
gets
your
lost
money,
in this.
8% matters.
All right, so I'm going to...
And about your buddy, your neighbor Billy, I think there are a lot better ways to help people who are in that situation
Adult daycare?
than deciding to punish other poor workers and Americans who want to hire them.
I'm going to step in here because we have one more subject to do, and then to you. So currently about 1.1 million people come in legally per annum, and 1 million plus, and it's hard to know exactly what that figure is, are undocumented and are coming in illegally. Let's talk about reforming the legal immigration system. So Alex, you may as well start. And I wanted to say, we should always get a libertarian. This is such fun. But so your view is we could allow a much, much, much larger group of legal immigrants.
Yes, absolutely. I think that the best mechanism for deciding who should come, if you're concerned about wages, concerned about the economy, is letting the economy determine that and not bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., or politicians or people who have no stake or issue in there. We let the economy decide all types of things, like how many t-shirts to make. We let them decide where people should work inside the United States. If they're Americans legal to work, we should let the economy decide who to hire if those people are from overseas. We should let the immigrants decide. We should let Americans decide, American consumers, businesses, individuals who want to deal with these individuals decide. I'm not a big fan of the government determining, this type of worker at this type of wage and this type of location subject to certain conditions based on some statistic gathered 5 years ago that's out of date. No, I'm not into that. I don't think that should be, and what we need to do is have a system that allows workers at basically every skill level, high skilled, low skilled, mid skilled, to come in and work in the United States. I work in a nonprofit research organization. My organization is not subject to numerical caps for the H-1B visa. They can hire as many as they want. I think it makes a better work environment. I have numerous comrades, numerous colleagues who come from overseas on this. I deal with this type of competition in the labor market every day. I'm not some hypocrite who's saying, like, let everybody else compete but me. I like competition. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. And we should have much more of this in other sections of the economy. And this is something that's good for Americans. It makes America stronger. It makes America more dynamic. It makes America bigger. It worked for us throughout most of our history. It will continue to work again. And I just hope that we don't continue along this path of restricting immigration, because it will result in a shrinking country, a poorer country, a smaller country, and I don't want my children to grow up in a country that's going to be smaller.
Okay, so let's just say we agree with you, and we start by doubling the number to 2.2 million.
It's a good start.
And then maybe 5 years from now we go to 4.4 and so on. So in other words, it's just not throw open the doors, but we experiment with increasing this number. And would you change the formula? I think you would. That it's not, that our formula also needs reform.
I do think our formula needs reform. I think that it is very restricted on the economic side. It is very difficult for economic migrants to come to this country lawfully and to work. The number of visas set aside, number of green cards set aside in the employment-based category is about 14%, but half of those are the family members actually of workers and not the workers themselves. So it's more like 7%. I think if you have a job offer, a good place to start, if you have a job offer in the United States, then there shouldn't be any numerical limit on that. I think that's a good place to start. If somebody is willing to hire you, is willing to pay you wages for you to come here, I think that's a good start.
All right, so Jessica, 2.2, 4.4, I'm guessing you're not on board with this.
No. I think it's time for us to return to more moderate levels of legal immigration.
So instead of 1.1, what would you put it at?
I would start, and I would probably say somewhere between 500 and 700,000 a year.
And
of new green cards.
Is one of your arguments that give us time to absorb, that absorption time is an important part of national policy?
That is one of the reasons, I think, to have a slowdown in legal immigration. I don't think it's the most important one. I think the most important reason is the labor market distortions that are occurring, and the fact that so many of the immigrants who are coming in now are going to have a harder time being self-sufficient in a modern economy.
Okay, so Alex rolled his eyes. I just want you to know that.
Sorry to
You
do that.
rolled your eyes.
I apologize.
You promised you wouldn't roll your eyes.
I apologize.
You rolled your eyes.
Take a point off of my final.
No more rolling of your eyes.
For that.
That was wrong.
That was wrong.
They went
Bad Alex.
right into the back of your head. I've been watching.
Now you're not going to pay for my dinner.
Right. No way. We will not roll our eyes. Jorge, where are you on this debate?
I think we have room and the ability to increase immigration in the U.S. and that we should do it. I agree that we need a lesser role for the federal government. We need a lesser role for, certainly for Congress, and a greater role for the private sector in determining how many people on the economic side come to the U.S. and where they ultimately go. I don't think that bureaucrats are particularly well suited at picking a number. I don't think that they are good at, I don't think that it is possible for them to revisit that number, as we have seen. So if they are tasked with doing that, we will end up with the same number as we have for the last 30 years, again, for some indeterminate period of time as well, and we'll be in the same situation. The downside of decreasing legal immigration will compound the situation that we're seeing at the border. We will end up with a greater population of undocumented immigrants. Just because we say, no, you can't come here, to more people, that doesn't mean they're not going to come. That will make the situation worse.
So Jessica, let me ask you that question, because several people on the panel have made kind of a compelling argument that they're coming one way or t'other. And so it would be better to make it legal and to increase the number, to make it more efficient, to make it more predictable, to make it more stable, and that by reducing the number, you're not going to reduce probably the number that try to get here. You're just going to change the path.
No, I don't agree that people are going to come no matter what. Immigration is not a force of nature that we can't control.
It might be. And that wasn't a role, but that was close to a role.
It just isn't. We're talking about people who are making choices and deciding that, and hearing from a number of different sources that if they come now, and we know this from talking to the migrants themselves, and who can blame them? They understand that if they come to the border now and present themselves to a Border Patrol agent, and especially if they say that they fear return to their home country, definitely if they come with a child, sometimes whether it's their child or not, that they're going to be, in all likelihood, allowed to stay here indefinitely, and even if they do not follow through with their applications, they're going to be able to either find someone to hire them illegally or with a stolen identity, or they're just not going to be removed because the current policy is that almost no one gets removed from the country unless you commit a very serious felony. So who wouldn't come? But we have found over time that when we step up enforcement a little bit, it changes the cost-benefit analysis that the migrants are making because they're smart people, and they're deciding that it's not worth handing over thousands of dollars to a criminal smuggler to bring them on a dangerous journey to cross because they're going to be sent back home. I mean, again, it's a rational process.
An important counterpoint to that exact point, that we can somehow create a policy that will make people, that will change their calculus. In 2018, or actually 2017, 2018, we instituted a policy of forcibly separating families, prosecuting the parents. Many of them remain separated to this day. That policy itself is one of the most horrific immigration policies we have ever had on the books. It's certainly the most horrific one that I have ever experienced. Despite that policy being in place, the next year, 2019, that we saw a record number of families come to the border, 540,000. So if having somebody rip your kid from your arms is not going to deter you from coming to the U.S., then what is?
Well, actually, the numbers did go down after that policy, which I thought was a huge mistake and not a good policy. But there were other reasons for the increase in 2019, including some court decisions.
If that policy, though, is what it took to achieve the type of border security that you would be happy with the legal immigration numbers that you want, so that the lower immigration numbers, would you approve of that policy?
Absolutely not.
So you would be willing to tolerate more?
No, I would choose other policies.
Like what?
Like saying if you've come through 9 safe countries on your way to the U.S. border, you don't get to apply for asylum. You're not going to qualify for it. That's one.
And you think that's going to work better than ripping children apart? That's going to be a more effective deterrent?
It was.
I'm going to move to the audience here. I want to just close that, though, by saying I think we're all feeling the same thing, and I know you do too, Jessica, that if enforcement winds up being cruel and inhumane and damaging families and traumatizing people sometimes permanently, that can't be the answer. And so firmness at the border is going to almost automatically invite a certain level of ruthlessness, and I don't see that we can really avoid that. And that's what really bothers me. Doesn't it bother you that if we all agreed with Jessica, I don't think we do in this audience, but in some you would, I have a hard time believing this can be done in a really highly humane and dignified way. And so it is kind of a force of nature in a certain way, and I don't like the America that I'm seeing, and this is not about the Trump administration, this is across administrations, it gets better and worse. I don't like that America, but I'm not there. I'm not down there. I'm not one of the border patrolmen. I don't live on the ranch nearby. I mean, I think we all get it that this is not an easy question to try to resolve, right? Okay, so let's do questions. Chris, you have a microphone, bunch of questions. Let's get to as many as we can. We won't all answer all of them.
Right, I was going to start there and just say, we don't need to all answer each question. Let's figure out who's best. And I would encourage you to be concise in your responses so we can get to a lot of questions.
And if you roll your eyes, you don't get to answer any more questions.
And I would encourage you, as always, to make sure that you actually have a question. We don't need a lot of backstory. We don't need all of that. Just get to the question, and we'll try to get to as many of these as we can. Hold the microphone like this, not like this, because it doesn't work. Keep it pretty close to your mouth. Don't turn anything on and off. It will be on the whole time. When you raise your arms, I'll bring it to you. When you ask your question, I'll take it to the next person. And I just want to reiterate this whole exercise. We never set out to solve the problem. We set out to discuss the problem, and hopefully that we all would have a better understanding that it's not just what we believe, there are more sides to it. So even in our question and answer, we're not going to solve the problem, but we're going to talk about it. Okay, so who's got the first question?
Oh boy, lots of questions.
So I was just wondering if, because you left lots of things out of this discussion, such as, did we ever study what immigration was like when almost everybody raised their hand and said they had grandparents who were immigrants? What exactly happened? For instance, was there a real lack of work available to indigenous residents, so to speak, when millions of people came in any one given year? How much businesses were actually created by those immigrants that hired other people? That kind of thing. In other words, we had an experience at a certain point when it was basically free immigration, kind of Alex's position. And we all benefited from it as their descendants. So why doesn't somebody study that to see whether Alex's position might be worthwhile?
Well, no one would think that, but I mean, we could have provided
I've heard worse.
We could have provided a better historical background to this. So, but I think that we all need to remember that there have always been new immigrant groups that have been heavily discouraged. Think of Chinese exclusion. I mean, this is a long history. My grandparents came in to be homesteaders in Iowa. That's the kind of story you're talking about, but there have always been either real or tacit quotas. Some peoples are more wanted than others. There has been deep discrimination. It's not as if everything was fine until 1942. And so I think if we had historians that just were looking at that, that would be another interesting program, and you should do that. But we're trying to sort out the current really desperate situation. But I think that we know more today than we've known ever before because of media and social media. That's one part of this. I think that America's gigantic economic success story is an incredible magnet. I think that there's been deterioration of basic security in Central America in a really desperate way. I think there's a north-south issue that's happening all over the world. I mean, there's a lot more to this than we're possibly going to even touch on tonight, but I don't think we should mythologize 1880 as some time when if you wanted to come here, you could just come. Remember, too, that the population, when Thomas Jefferson said, "Come one, come all," the population, non-natives, non-indigenous people, but the population was 4 million. So that's a whole different world that we're talking about here. But just to take your question seriously, but saying, sorry, we didn't provide more.
Can I just add to that? You know, what the symposium, this is a 2-hour program. So we were trying to figure out what can we do for the greatest number of people in 2 hours. This could have been a 3-day symposium, lots of different things, but we would have had 25 people show up for 3 days.
True.
And so that's something that we realized, that in our day and age, people are willing to give you an hour and a half, 2 hours, and we want to get to a lot of people. So I think we wanted to cover that, and so we need to do more symposiums.
Absolutely. Well, yes, Carrie.
My question is, I understand there's quotas for different countries. Should that system be revamped or something like that? I mean, have we revised how many people from each country get to come?
Yeah, we have over the years. The way it works is not so much for the family categories, but in the employment-based categories, the number of employment visas are set at a pierceable cap of 7%, but once demand is fulfilled for people applying from all over the world, then any countries that were capped get to have the remaining visas left. So for example, theoretically, and you hear this a lot in the debate, skilled immigrants from India are limited to 7% of the total, but in reality, they're allowed to use 25% of the total because, you know, there aren't enough other people coming from other countries in the world to use them up. So it's very flexible. Yes, exactly.
So, and do we think that the country quota system, which was once much more pronounced than it is today, is justifiable or not?
Wholly unjustifiable. We got to judge people by individuals, not based on the geographic area where they were born. My neighbor Ajit from India came here in 2004 on a student visa. He just got his green card like 2 months ago. So we had a party for him. It took him that long amount of time. He was on a student visa, OPT, H-1B, took forever. People entering the green card category that he was in, where he got in, you know, the estimated wait times are about a century now for that. I mean, it's a joke.
So we have 12 minutes. So
for people who are entering now, the estimated wait times are a century, and that depends on the mortality statistics that you use, which is how long the wait time is. And that's absurd. That's absurd.
On the other hand, it's good to have diversity and allow employers to recruit people from countries that don't send a lot, you know, Cameroon or wherever.
We shouldn't have government-enforced diversity based on arbitrary borders of where people are born, though. We should judge people by individuals. That's what we do in this country. That's the inheritance of the Enlightenment.
Next question.
For all the panel, which other countries' immigration policy do you most admire?
Good question.
Great question.
You answer that one.
Which other country's immigration policy do we most admire?
Do we get a time machine?
Sorry, we're Americans. We
Today, right? Today. You know, I think there are different aspects in different countries that are pretty good. So I think the U.S. family-based immigration system, it has a lot of problems, but it's probably one of the better ones around the world. I think the Singaporean system for temporary workers, especially low, mid-skilled, and high-skilled workers, is pretty good. I think you combine the American high-skilled immigration system, where it's basically employer-driven, like employers want to hire people and go through the system. You combine that with the much higher numbers of the Australian system, and I think you have that is pretty good. And then you have the sort of Canadian sponsorship, private sponsorship for all refugees. You incorporate that in the United States. I think you've got a pretty good system. I would be happy retiring if that were the system.
So we now have 48 million people living in this country who were not born in this country. That's a lot. So whatever's wrong with our system, it's amazing in a certain way. That 48 million people is a lot of people, and they were born somewhere else, and they got to this country one way or t'other. And the vast majority of them, overwhelming majority of them, are doing important work. contributing to our social structure and our economy. I think of my own grandparents coming from Germany, because why? They weren't being persecuted in Germany, although that can happen in Germany. But they weren't. They came because of the Homestead Act. They wanted a part of the American dream, and that's one of the most deeply held American values, and all of you have been the beneficiary of that. And so when we see what's wrong, there's plenty that's wrong with our system, but it's a pretty amazing statistic. I mean, compare that, say, to Finland,
Japan,
China, Korea. Go
Saudi
ahead.
Arabia.
My question was, what about work visas that lead to a clear path to citizenship? Work to citizenship.
Work to
I'm
citizenship.
curious about what the panelists say about that.
What about that?
So I can tell you specifically, it's a difficult process to navigate work-placed employment visas. With our TPS employees at CU Boulder, the reason why they started working with us in the clinic is because President Trump tried to end TPS protections for El Salvador and a number of other different countries, and in ending those TPS protections, he told hundreds of thousands of people that they had to figure out another way to stay here. And so what we were able to do in the clinic was convince CU Boulder to sponsor those employees through an employment-based visa process. It is extraordinarily difficult and onerous to get through. You have to get through a Department of Labor certification. CU Boulder graciously and amazingly stepped up and paid a tremendous amount of fees in order to then petition for those employees through an I-140 petition process. And part of that process was to show that there were no US citizen or lawful permanent residents who were willing and able to take those jobs.
So before I want to take over with 3 minutes to go, Chris, so we'll take 2 more questions, but Violetta, I just want to say, I think one thing that we've all learned here tonight is real respect for the work that you're doing at CU Boulder. Amazing. How can we help, or can we just, is there any way we can help?
You can always donate to the clinics. We are constantly, so one thing that we're able to do is cover people's fees. Because they're extraordinarily high fees. For example, a DACA renewal is $495 per person. A lot of our DACA recipients are in college. If someone had asked me to come up with $495 when I was a sophomore in college, I would have been like, oh, sure, I don't have that.
So we could if we wanted.
You can donate to the clinic, we cover those fees.
Can we volunteer? I mean, is there?
Yeah, we're always needing interpreters, or people who can help us communicate. Right now we need anybody who can speak Russian or Ukrainian. Anyone? So we need those kinds of things. But so the workplace visa process, just to say, has been extraordinarily time consuming and onerous, and it shouldn't be as difficult to do that.
Chris, let's do one more.
I have a question and an observation. What can we do about the enormous amount of talent that we are sending home from our universities? My would-be son-in-law got a PhD in computer security, and he's one of those untrustworthy Canadians, and it took him 4 years to get a green card. It's ridiculous.
So we invest in these people and then we get rid of many of them.
Well, they pay their own way usually. Foreign students pay their own way. So they've invested in themselves and
yeah, we educate them in our schools, and we spend tremendous amount of resources.
My favorite example of that was Erdal Erkan. He was a Turkish PhD in the United States. I believe it was Caltech. 2009, he published a paper in information technology that solved some fundamental problems, a theory that allowed the creation of 5G. He wasn't allowed to stay in the United States. He went back to Turkey. And instead of being in the United States doing additional research, working with American companies, he sold all of his inventions to Huawei. And he got involved with Huawei, which is why the Chinese firm, now I'm not a big hawk against China, right? But I don't like totalitarian communist states, obviously, right? So I like to think about how many people like this have we kicked out, that we have not allowed to stay, because they might compete with other computer scientists and engineers. Like, give me a break.
well, there's
Go ahead.
I mean, I think a lot of us here on this panel would agree that our employment-based visa system, I mean, it badly needs reform. And if you don't like government regulation, I think that's why a point system, for example, would be much easier.
Do you favor increasing the numbers of skilled immigrant workers?
Perhaps within the context of cuts in other areas like the lottery. Yeah, absolutely. I think our legal immigration system needs to have a higher balance of skilled immigrants over the other categories.
Let's do one more.
Okay, I just want to add a flip side to that, because a number of the other programs we've done, some of our panelists have talked about the fact that people who have come here to get educated don't want to stay because of the state of the country, and so they want to go back. So there's two sides to that.
And
it's not an immigration issue, but it's a state of the country issue. But I'm going to let this young lady have the final question.
Let them decide.
Yeah.
I just want an opinion.
Right close to your mouth.
An opinion.
We can hear it.
You've mentioned legal immigration of 1.5 million, illegal of 1 million, approximately in the last year, or historically, recently, year after year. And they're all coming in, or most of it, through the southern border. I want to know your opinion of what the governor of Texas has done recently to get some of these, because they can't put all these people up. So if you've got 1 million illegals all coming into California and Texas, we have X amount of sanctuary cities, let's say San Francisco, Chicago, New York, and him busing into some of these cities, and now these mayors are just having these heart attacks going, what are we going to do with these people? So I just wanted your opinion of kind of what's good for the goose is good for the gander, or what do you think?
So the cities where he's sending these people already have enormous populations of illegal immigrants. And on the part of the mayors in these cities, the destination cities, it's obviously just deployed to get more federal government money. And on Governor Abbott's part, I think it's it's a ridiculous sort of stunt that spends a lot of government money, which he apparently complains about spending money on illegal immigrants elsewhere, but he's going to give them a bus ride somewhere else. So it's just like this political stunt that I think is like ludicrous and ridiculous, and a total waste of resources. Like Texas has a booming labor market. These people are being employed while in Texas. Let's let them. I don't want to give them a government bus ticket. Let's let them figure out where to go.
Anybody else?
Well, I thought it was a brilliant political stunt. Stunt, yeah. I don't think it's going to solve anything, but I thought it drew public attention to what people in Texas have been, the communities, particularly along the border, have been dealing with. And I thought it was pretty interesting that the mayor of New York, for example, had a panic attack about a couple of bus loads of people coming on buses from Texas, which does save Texas some money, but said nothing about charter flights of people being dropped off in the dead of night with far more people arriving in New York. So, I mean, like I said, I thought it was a pretty brilliant political move. That's not going to change anything.
All right, so I want to say a couple of things. First of all, thank you. I know the evening's long. This is tough. At times it gets complex, and I think we all come away with some frustration. I hope that our panelists have learned from each other, and maybe the needle has moved for each of us. I hope. Well, I don't suppose anything does Alex's needle, but I hope that we've all learned a little from this. How many of you feel that this was a valuable conversation?
Good. Yeah.
My daughter is at Oxford University. She's getting a PhD in history, writing about the Tower of London. She's dating a French-Swiss boy named Simon. And I heartily approve of him. He's just terrific. But I said to her recently on top of a mountain in Montana, would he maybe want to come live in America after he gets his doctorate? And she said, his family is worried that he would come to a country with mass gun violence. Think of that. Talk about problems we need to have a conversation about with the Vail Symposium. The Those who wish to stay, we'll have a little kind of debriefing here. Chris, thank you very much. I want to thank all of our panelists, Violetta Chapin, Jessica Vaughn, Jorge Lowry, Alex Narashta. Finally, sorry. You pissed me off, buddy. So I'm going to give your name up, but thank you all. Thanks very much.